right, so thanks everybody for coming. And right, so for the next couple of hours, I'm going to be talking about seed saving, and it's basically a simple introductory course to seed saving. And when you come away from this course, you won't be a seed expert or a plant reader, but hopefully you'll be more interested in trying to save seeds yourself. And that's sort of the idea of this course. So my name is Andrew McMillion, and I'm a board member of the Norwegian Seed Savers, which in Norwegian is called KVAM, Kunnskap og vern av nytteplanter i Norge. And it's a membership organization that was established in 2016 out of what was previously sort of a loose group of plant clubs that have been around for about 10 years. And it's what's called a community seed bank, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. In fact, the subject of this whole gathering has to do with gene banks, actually. So this course is sort of an introduction to the debate, which we'll be having afterwards, about gene banks and the roles of gene banks in relation to climate change. So let's see if I can get this thing to work. So, a little bit about me. This is carrot seeds in my greenhouse. And my story, just really briefly, is that I worked for Apple Computers in 2005, and I decided that I wanted to move back to Norway. This was in the States. I wanted to move back to Norway and change my life a little bit and become a little bit more environmentally friendly. I started addressing, I was at that point very techno-optimistic. Everybody knows what that means probably, right? So relating to climate change, there are different approaches, and one of the main ones has been that we can solve the problem of climate change by throwing technology at it, right? Solar panels, windmills, electric cars, all that. And since I've been working for Apple, I was like, yeah, that's definitely the solution. And so I was involved in politics for the Green Party and pushing solar panels, and bought myself an electric car. And there's something called the 3 B's in Norwegian. It's biff, bolig, og bil. And if you start with the first one, bil, which is transportation. So if you're going to try and make an impact to cut back on your carbon emissions, you want to first focus on your transportation, which is going to be probably the easiest thing to do something about. So not flying and not transporting yourself around or your goods around too much. So basically, start off by cutting down flying, moved over to electric car, and then the next thing is bolig, or house, right? So how do you live in the building you live in? Is your building well insulated? What is your electric footprint? All those types of issues. And then the final one is biff, which is food, right? And in order of importance, it's the most impact to the least impact in a sense, but the hardest one to do something about. And that's one thing you'll find with climate change, is that the further forward you move in dealing with it, the more difficult it becomes, right? And dealing with food is really much more difficult than dealing with your house or your transportation, because it's a part of your culture, it's a part of, it surrounds you, you're all kind of locked into systems of eating. And we don't really think so much about it, but the production of our food has an immense footprint, right? It depending on how you calculate it, anywhere from 10 to 30% of global emissions come just from food production and transportation. A study was recently done in the University of California that shows that for every kilo of vegetables somebody produces, you're offsetting 2 kilos of carbon equivalents, right? And that's because you don't transport it, because you're getting it direct, because you're growing organic, if you're recycling your nutrients, because you're composting. All those types of factors all add up to a significant impact. So basically, I've been, for the last 5 years, I've been growing more and more vegetables. And in the beginning, it was just to grow, and I didn't know anything, literally. The first year was 2012, and I planted stuff outside in the field, and it died. Like maybe 30%, the stuff that, like chives and stuff, that worked. But anything complicated just died. And I was really depressed. Oh my God, what a mess. And then so 2013, I did nothing. And then in 2014, I heard about the plant club. And I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. Connected with the plant club, and suddenly I got all these seeds, right, from Stephen Barstow. He's the head of the Norwegian Seed Savers. And then everything sort of changed. Everything got more interesting, right? And it wasn't just then about growing vegetables for me, but it was about also connecting to a different part of ecosystems, which is seed saving, right? And so from there, that was 2014, 15, I found this greenhouse, which another farm had. It's 300 square meters. And I asked them, you know, where can I get a greenhouse? I said, well, you can have this one because I'm retiring. Like, okay. I had paid hardly nothing, like $1,000 for the whole greenhouse. But of course I had to deconstruct it and move it to my house or my farm and reconstruct it. And that took a whole year. So all winter long, every weekend up there, unbolting and then putting it back together again. But then, of course, once we got it up, then it was just nonstop. And for me, it's kind of like I was talking earlier, Joelle, about it, that for me, it's kind of like, and I write an article about this, about seed saving as surfing waves. So that, and same thing with living in an ecosystem and interacting in an ecosystem, everything happens in waves. So what you're seeing here is kind of what I call peak resonance, when all the plants are like, it's kind of like a choir, you know, when you get everything singing together, and it sounds great, right? But it doesn't get that way without some practice and some basic knowledge of music and art. And so for me, this moment is like the moment every year that I'm waiting for, you know, when everything, you know, resonates. And that's kind of like, you have to ride waves, right? And so you learn how to get all these waves moving together. It's kind of like, I liken it to bouncing a ball, right? So if you start tapping a ball when it's on the ground, you start tapping it, it takes a lot of work just to get it to move a little bit. But as you start to tap it, once it starts rolling, then you can just stand and tap, just hardly give it any energy at all, and then it bounces, right? And it's the same thing with ecosystems, right? But just like a ball, an ecosystem can quite quickly tip out of balance. You lose the ball, right? And then you have to start again, right? So the key is to sort of find a way to interact with your ecosystem, and maybe you'll have 2 balls or 3 balls, God knows how many balls, right, going at once. And then it gets fun. So this is the farm. That's the greenhouse, and we try and do some storing in the stubble, which is like the old traditional way to store vegetables. And you can see in the back garden there are raised beds. So I grow basically in the raised beds in front of the greenhouse, in front of the house, which are all protection from wind. And then the greenhouse is where I do most of the growing. And in the back you can see a ravine, and that ravine is like a wildlife preserve because we live right on the edge of a forest. And so this time of year when they start hunting, all the deer and moose, not all of them, but a lot of them, they come and they hang out in the ravine there. So that's kind of nice. And since we're the only organic farm around, that's like a desert around us, except for this green patch here, which is clover for sheep. And so they come there and they eat, which is really nice. So yeah, it's an ecosystem. So the reason why, again, like I was saying, the reason why I went in this direction is not by chance. I had no interest in ecosystems at all. But the global warming anxiety that I felt pushed me over the years to do more and more, right? And as you start getting involved and as you start learning about ecology, you start understanding the depth of the problem, which most people don't understand. Really, what Greta Thunberg is talking about, she's not joking around. She says, you know, listen to the scientists, understand what this really means. Don't just look at it from a human perspective, but look at it from an ecological perspective. We're doing serious damage to our ecology, and we've been doing it for at least 100, 150 years, right? What we've done is, the whole globe has gone in ramping up production mode. Production. More and more production, right? And that's been the only sort of guiding principle for our civilization. Does it produce more? Yes. Can we create more jobs? Yes. Can we create more money? Yes. Do it. That's it, right? What that has done from an ecological perspective is it's created this huge bottleneck, right? So again, if you think of it in terms of waves, right? Waves are fun to ride before they crash, right? And we're at that point now, where it's starting to crash. It's still fun, but it's about to crash, right? And so from the perspective of doing something for the environment, cutting back on your energy use, all the things that you hear about in media that you can do, they're all important, right? But from an ecological perspective, there's a lot more work that we need to be doing, right? And a lot of it comes back to seeds, right? So we need to be, as this picture shows, we need to be opening up the bottleneck, right? Reducing the pressure by managed responses, right? I'll go back one more time, that there are actually, three different bottlenecks, right? The first one is extinction, right? This is the sixth extinction that we're in now, and that's what this picture shows. The second one is food security, right? So if you go back 100 years, everybody had some sort of relationship to their food by actually interacting with their ecology, but nowadays we're more and more separated from it, and many people don't know this, but in Norway, we're only 40% self-sufficient, which is the same level that we were at in World War II. So we've become no less self-sufficient over the last 80 years. That's strange when you think that we're always being told that we're living in a culture of progress. But seen from that perspective, we've made no progress since World War II. In fact, during World War II, 25–30% of the population were engaged in agriculture. Now, 3% of the Norwegian population directly relate to food production. And most of them are sitting in tractors, which in my opinion is not really directly relating with your ecology. That's directly relating with a machine that relates with your ecology. And then the third bottleneck is reproduction, right? So because our culture has been so production focused, we've forgotten that that's not everything. There's reproduction as well. And who's responsible for reproduction? Who knows anything about reproduction? How does reproduction work? And I'm not just talking about one species reproduction, I'm talking about ecosystems reproduction, right? Reproduction of what we eat. And that's the bottleneck that I'm mostly interested in, which is probably the least focused of the three. So this is a picture from National Geographic, which shows the American cultivar diversity over the last 100 years. So this is from 1903. How many varieties of beets, of cabbage, and so on that we had in 1903. And by 1983, so within 80 years, that's how much we've gotten. So the pattern's pretty clear. We've created a bottleneck for ourselves. Now, a lot of people might say, yeah, but most of those beets sucked, right? We didn't like those beets anyway, so it's no big loss. Well, from a genetic perspective, it's not just about taste, right? It's about culture. Humans have been coexisting, co-evolving with all these cultivars over hundreds and thousands of years, right? Squash, 6,000 years of evolution, co-evolution. Corn, 9,000 years. Beans, 20,000 years. And now suddenly, 90% gone, right? Just in the last 100 years. And then the question is, why did that happen? Well, it happened because we outsourced all of that to machines and research institutes, right? So whereas before, you got your beet seeds from your grandma, and it was a part of your tradition. You know, you didn't just go to church on Sunday, you saved these seeds. These are the seeds that you got from your ancestors. This is your culture, right? In recent decades, we're talking about 1980 to currently, the seed industry has been consolidating to the point now where you have 4 companies that own 95% of the world's seed, right? This is the history from 1990 to 2017 of all these companies and how they've merged and merged and merged in what, from an economic perspective, looks like a grand idea. Everybody gets richer. We consolidate power. We grow. But what's happening? From an ecosystem's perspective, you're creating a bottleneck, right? You're creating an ownership bottleneck, right? On the other side, as a reaction to this, partially as a reaction, but also just from a cultural perspective, in the 70s started the whole community seed bank revolution. right? And the community seed bank revolution really starts with the seed savers exchange in the States and has its roots at actually even further back. You could say Nikolai Vavilov, if anybody have heard of him. He was a collector, collected seeds from all over the world, and he ended up being starved to death by Stalin. And there's a place called the Vavilov Institute in St. Petersburg, and during World War II, the people who watched that seed bank, they literally died of starvation in the seed vaults. They didn't eat the seeds that they had. They could have survived if they'd eaten the seeds, but they didn't eat the seeds. They died of starvation instead of eating those seeds. That's how much the seed bank meant to them. And that whole movement, the community seed bank movement, really starts to take off with the Seed Savers Exchange in the States in the 70s. And it sees this trend that's happening where everything is getting consolidated in the hands of a few organizations, and where nobody's taking care of these cultivars anymore. Nobody gives any interest to the diversity, and says, no, we're going to start working against that, but we're going to do it in a communal way. We're going to work together to do this. And that idea spread quickly. So you see, by 1990, which is about 20 years after or 15 years after the Seed Savers Exchange, the Austrian Arkadua Community Seed Bank was established. Today they have 15,000 members, and this is their center, where they reproduce their seeds. The Norwegian Seed Savers have 500 members, just to put that in perspective, right? And the Swedish SESAM, which is our sister organization, they have about 1,000 members. But this is really important, right? These are the people who are taking care of the diversity that before every village took care of, right? In some cases, there are still villages that take care of their own varieties in Western cultures, but not many. I'll show you a couple. All right, so a part of this course is to show people or to talk about why it's important to save seeds. And from my perspective, it's important to go all the way back in time and look at how do we look at seeds as mammals, right? How have we been relating to seeds for millions of years? Not just our recent history, right? And to do that, I try and bring to mind something psychological, which is something called a Gestalt switch. And that is where you change your perspective on what you're looking at. So in this case, you have two different ways of looking at it, right? It could either be a gorilla and a lion, or a tree. And so this is a metaphor for changing your perspective from the anthropocentric or human-focused perspective of seeds to a biocentric perspective. And that's what I'm going to try and relate to you now, okay? So the aim now in the next couple slides is to have you switch your mentality from the way you've been looking at seeds most of your life probably without even thinking about it to a new way of looking at seeds. So maybe some of you don't believe in evolution, I do. If you go back hundreds of millions of years to the age of dinosaurs, we competed with dinosaurs in a totally different ecology than we have today, right? We were tiny little rodent-like creatures that lived underground. And we had basically three things on our minds. Don't get eaten. That was the first one, right? Find seeds and store them. That was the second one. And then reproduce. Those were the three most important. That was pretty much our whole lives. They were short, and those were the three things we thought about. Then when the dinosaurs died, that opened up an opportunity for us. Suddenly we could come out of our holes, and we evolved to the conscious beings that we are today. In that evolution, we evolved together with flowering plants, right? And most of what we ate was actually plants for most of our evolution, plants and seeds. So we have in our mammalian brain, we have an instinct to see a seed and think, lots of energy, food, eat, right? Or store it. Seeds are better for storing than vegetables because they don't rot as easily. But from a perspective of ecosystems, that's not what seeds are, right? We are just a vehicle for seeds, which have an ecosystem function of getting through bottlenecks. That's what seeds are for, right? Seeds are escape capsules, so to speak. They are, when the energy in an ecosystem collapses, like a wave, then the seed is produced at the end. It's the very end of the seed. It's like that, the drop. When the plant drops to the ground, the seed comes, right? And it's there, and it stays until there's enough energy for that bounce to start coming back again, right? And then it sprouts, and it's just like real small in the beginning. And then it, right? So it has an ecosystem's function for regenerating an ecosystem. That's what its function is, right? And our position in that evolution, co-evolution as an ecology, is to make mistakes in our storage facilities. Oh shit, where did I store that seed, right? And then, right? And that's still the case for squirrels, right? And for rats, and for mice. They're doing that all the time, birds. So we come from a co-evolution with seeds. That's our job, so to speak, our function from the ecosystem's perspective. Now, keystone species is another really important aspect of ecosystems. Ecosystems, not all species are created equal. Some species are keystone species, right? For instance, there's the longleaf pine in the States, which is one example of a keystone species around which hundreds of species exist, or oak, right, in Europe. Oak species. This is why the Celts worship the oak, right? Because it wasn't just any ordinary tree. This tree was obviously something around which a lot of stuff happened, right? Humans have become the prime keystone species on the planet. But we are only that, we only have the potential for that. At this stage, we're actually degenerators, our net impact on the ecology of the biosphere. The biosphere is just the sum of all ecologies, right? We are now net degraders. But we all have the potential to become regenerators, right? And a part of that is to change your perspective on what it is you're doing, and change your perspective of who you are. Take yourself out of the center. Humans aren't that important, really, right? We are a part of something. We are part of a web. And we're not just individuals with freedom to do whatever we want, right? We evolved in a setting. And that setting is actually gorgeous, really gorgeous, and potential to be even more beautiful. Or potential to get totally destroyed, which is what we're up to now. Here's one of the keystone individuals that I'm connected to. This is the last Mandan corn priestess. Her name is Scattered Corn. She's the daughter of Moose Lily. She was the last corn priestess. Up on the table over there, I have seeds that I saved that come directly from her. And these are the squash that I saved those seeds from just a month ago, or a few weeks ago. Right? So this is real. This is actual culture. These are actual people. These are actual seeds. This is an actual story. This is beautiful, right? This can be destroyed easily. At the worst point, there were 250 Mandan left on the planet. And this squash is hard to get a hold of, right? What's interesting about it for Norway? The interesting thing about it for Norway is the Mandan, when they started in the south of America, along the Mississippi River 1,000 years ago, they had to migrate because of wars. They migrated up to the Missouri River. And they settled in the Missouri River, and they brought their squash and their corn and their beans with them. And the Missouri is much further north. And they were one of the few agricultural tribes in that area. The rest of them were Crow and whatnot, Sioux, who were nomadic tribes. But they grew their corn and their beans along these riverbeds, which were small microclimates, right? In North Dakota, right? In fact, Norwegians who moved to North Dakota have a good relationship with the Mandan because they're both agriculturalists, right? So this squash has actually evolved with humans. This is the most northern variety of squash in the world. That could be interesting for Norway, since we're pretty far north, right? And that's how come I started growing it, because I was interested in growing squash. I checked out 50 different squash. I was like, what's the one with the most northern history? And then we get to Mandan, right? So this is the kind of thing that seed savers do. They try and look and they trial, which we'll come back to later, they trial varieties that have certain properties that might work in ecosystems. And humans have been doing that for thousands of years. It's nothing new. Usually just by trial and error. This is another one that I take care of. So what I call this stewarding, and in the Norwegian seed savers we have guilds that steward plants. This is Shetland kale. Very likely this is the cabbage that Norwegians all eat fårikål. And before fårikål, you would be lucky to get a little bit of sheep in your cabbage stew during the Viking times. And the cabbage stew was this, basically, right? It was kale. So this is like the forerunner to cabbage. And in the Shetland Islands, traditionally, which was a Norwegian, outpost for hundreds of years, the Shetland Islanders, it was 30% of the calories for all humans and animals in the Shetland Islands for hundreds of years. And into the 1950s, there were 50 farms that reproduced seed, and now there's 13, right? So we have some work to do in trying to maintain these varieties, and we need actual people to do it, right? And that's what community seed banks are trying to do, actually keep them alive, right? And that's called in situ preservation, as opposed to ex situ, which we'll hear more about later. Basically, ex situ is what they do in Svalbard, where they freeze it down. It's like a backup. In situ is actually keeping it alive, making sure that it continues to evolve. And it's a part of a tradition. So categories of reproduction. You have conservation, which is what I'm talking about now, maintaining cultivars, right? So if you're going to maintain the Mandan squash or the Shetland kale, then you're doing conservation. And that's called upland in Norwegian. And then plant breeding, which is a whole other kettle of fish, under which you have adaptation to climate change is one category of plant breeding. That's foredling. That's a bit more tricky, right? So production, growing vegetables, that's fairly easy. Reproduction, that's harder. Adaptation, that takes skill. It's fun, it's educational, and that's when you start evolving. Now actually anybody who's reproducing is also working with adaptation, because you can't do one without the other. But traditionally, reproducing true to kind seeds means to select away anything that's deviant, right? So if the plant starts to evolve in a direction that's not characteristic, then you take out the individuals that are deviating. Now that's actually counter evolutionary. In evolution, the selection pressure doesn't come from a conscious being, it comes from the environment. But humans are able to be the selection pressure consciously. And that depends then we've taken the responsibility, so to speak, of the evolutionary responsibility, and then we have to think about that. We can't just do that mindlessly like we've been doing. We've been doing the selection process from an anthropocentric perspective for the last 150 years. But we need to be doing it from a biocentric perspective, right? All right. Then there's something called plant breeding, participatory plant breeding. And that's where you have whole groups of people who work together to adapt plants in networks. And you can, by doing that, you can do work much more quickly. There are several networks that are doing this. And there's a link here to a whole 600-page document on plant breeding for those who are interested. But what I'm going to talk about is not that, because I don't expect anybody here to be an agriculturalist interested in plant breeding. What I do hope is that some of you might end up doing what he's doing, having a little stand selling some vegetables, which is a very nice hobby to have. And if you do that, then you might as well save some seeds while you're at it. And so that's kind of what, at least that's what I'm doing, and that's what we're hoping more people will do, which is sort of get a little bit back to some tradition that we've had in the past. So just a little bit on basic biology for seed saving. Just going through what is a species and a variety, how to keep varieties clean, pollination, isolation, selection, and then the difference between hybrids and seed varieties. Before we do that, just go through the 3 categories of plants, just so that we get this into context, because mostly what I'm going to be talking about are annuals and biannuals. And humans have mostly eat annuals and biannuals, very few perennials. The perennials that we eat are usually fruits and nuts. But all the cereals are annuals, mostly. There are some perennials, but mostly they're annuals. And so that's what I'm going to be focusing on. But in the Norwegian seed savers, and in the whole permaculture movement, I don't know how many people have heard of that, but permaculture is a sort of a newly evolved discipline or subculture within organic agriculture that was a reaction to the Club of Rome's report in 1972 called Limits to Growth, which was really the first sort of major report that challenged the current mode of sort of capitalist-dominated, production-focused societies, and said that, look, there are consequences to the way we're organizing ourselves on this planet, and we have to find limits to our growth, otherwise it's going to be real messy. And permaculture said, okay, there's Bill Mollison and David Holmgren were the two Australians who started it. And they said, okay, we're taking this seriously. We're not going to wait for some technological fix. We're just going to go and look at all the tools that we already have, and we're going to say, how can we cut down on our energy consumption? And in that whole movement, a lot of the move goes to perennials, because perennials, from an ecosystem's perspective, are more stable. Generally speaking, annuals are sort of pioneer plants that come in disrupted areas. So for instance, one of the reasons why we carve up soil, by plowing and then planting annuals is because annuals are establishment plants in disrupted ecologies, whereas perennials are established plants that come back year after year, right? So annuals just means that they flower once a year and then they die. Biennials means that they'll overwinter either one year. Sometimes there's sort of an in-between between biennials and perennials. So for instance, brassicas can be either perennial or biennial, but it basically means they won't flower the first year unless they're very stressed. And then the second year is when you save seeds from them. So they're usually a little bit more tricky, especially up north, because overwintering can be a challenge in extreme climates. Whereas perennials have the benefit that since they're already established, as soon as there's good weather, they can come up and start putting on weight. So permaculturalists have said, well, this is a better category of plants to work with. Firstly, humans haven't been working with them, probably partially because we moved around a lot. Slash and burn was very, very common for agriculture for thousands of years. Whereas now that we're set in one spot, it makes sense to find plants that that give us a crop every year that we don't have to do too much work with. So permaculturalists are always trying to create what's called food forest gardens, right, where you have plants in one place and you keep harvesting from them. Basically, if you want to have a stable ecosystem, you can't just have a stable ecosystem with annuals and biannuals. So basically, per definition, modern agriculture is an immature ecosystem, right? Modern agriculture is imitating immature ecosystems, and it's simplifying immature ecosystems even more, right? So it's not a good situation to be in from an ecosystem's perspective. What is a species and a variety? Now, most of you probably know this, but I'll just run by it really quickly, right? So in this case, we're looking at onions. And we have the genus, which is allium. All onions fall under the allium genus. And then there are species, right? So in here you have leeks on the left, and then you have garlic, Allium sativum, and then you have all the different kippa onions, which is what we usually think of as being onions. And then you have gräsböck on the chives on the right there. Now, this does in no way shows you the diversity of alliums. Stephen Barstow, who's the head of Norwegian Sea Savers, he set up a garden at the Botanical Gardens here in Trondheim, an allium garden that has 200 species of allium. It's one of the biggest collections in Scandinavia, maybe even in the world, of alliums. So the diversity just within the genus allium is enormous, right? And all of them are edible. So why we decided to stick to these 5 species, hard to say. Inside of each of these species, there are many different varieties. And varieties, what differentiates variety from species is that all varieties of a species can cross. So, right, any two members of a species can cross. But if you have two different varieties that are far enough apart, when they cross, you'll get some kind of a hybrid between the two, right? And we'll talk more about hybrids later on. Hybrids are not necessarily a bad thing. That's a normal thing to happen in an ecosystem, a hybridization. The question is just, what do humans do with it? How do humans deal with hybrids, right? So there again, you can look at hybrids from an anthropocentric or a biocentric perspective. This is one variety of Allium sativum, which is a hardneck garlic. And I have these bugles up here for anybody who wants. So what Allium sativum does is, instead of reproducing sexually, it reproduces vegetatively. That is to say, it creates cloves, right? So each one of those garlic heads has anywhere from 4 to 15, maybe, cloves, right, in one head. And each one of those, when you break them off and put them in the ground in the fall, can become a whole new head the next year. But the original hardneck garlics, which are from the Caucasus area, they will shoot up a head that's about this high, and instead of making flowers, they make these little vegetative copies. They're clones, right? And they can make anywhere from 10 to 50 of those little bugles. And that's what we have up here. So if you take one of those, there'll be a perfect copy of the parent, more or less, and you plant one of those in the ground. The next year, it makes a little onion, and the year after that, it makes one of those, right? So, then, how to keep varieties clean. Now that's the next topic here. So before we get into how we do that, we have to divide these varieties up into 3 different categories to sort of talk about them. We have cultivars, and cultivars just mean plants that humans have co-evolved with. Plants that humans have been selecting. So everything you buy in the store is a cultivar, right? You would not have found them in nature if it weren't for humans, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they're human creations. They're not. They're a part of an ecosystem's evolution. But the conscious mind has co-evolved with those plants to select for human beneficial traits for humans, right? So corn, for instance, was just a tiny little plant with tiny little seeds 10,000 years ago. And over many, many generations, it's evolved to this big, huge thing with monstrous seeds on it, right? Which is really good for humans because we can get lots of energy out of it, right? Heirlooms are cultivars that are open pollinated, which we'll talk about later. Open pollinated basically just means that if you save seeds from them, they will be the same as their parents, right? And that's interesting if you have a plant that you really like and you want to be able to have that same plant again next year, then you want an open pollinated plant. And the whole point of heirlooms is that they are open pollinated and that they should be saved seeds from, right? And that's what almost all plants were, all cultivars were heirloom or land races up until 100 years ago. And a land race is the same thing as an heirloom, except that heirlooms can come from one place that will have moved around, right? So like a potato that came from Bolivia and then moved to Ireland 200 years ago is still an heirloom, but it's not linked to its original homeland, its original place. Land races are like, for instance, the Shetland kale. It comes from Shetland, and it has, usually land races have more genetic diversity. So if you look here, we have the Nanticoke squash from the Nanticoke tribe in the northeast United States. And you can see by looking at that picture that there's a lot of diversity in that land race, right? And those are really interesting if you want to start selecting. So from there, you could select pretty much anything. You could go in any direction, right? Take all the blue ones only, right? And if you just selected blue for 4 or 5 generations, you'd select out everything else. But there's always a trade-off. Any selection you do, you're going to be deselecting something else. So you have to think about, well, how is that going to affect the whole population if I do that, right? Crop wild relatives is another category, which are just basically the original plants before we started selecting them, right? And it's, in many cases, we don't even know what they are, or they don't exist anymore. because the cultivars have taken up their ecologies, their ecological niches. And then you have populations, which are ecological units, and they're sort of like a landrace is a population. It just means that it's not uniform. There's so much diversity in it that it's hard to even call it a species, or hard to call it a variety. And so the clean aspect really comes in only with modern agriculture, because what happened in the last 100 years is we started selecting for uniformity, right? We wanted a plant that is exactly this size because it needs to go through that machine, or it needs to be ripe at a certain time, right? And so then we create traits, like lists of traits. This variety has these traits, right? And then if you want to keep it clean, you have to do the selection job to make sure that it stays that way. Open pollinated, I talked about that earlier. It's more or less, plants that are more or less identical to parents. Then you have wind pollination. For instance, spinach is wind pollinated. In spinach you have a male and a female plant, and you need wind to get the pollen from the male to the females. Fairly straightforward. Same with corn. No, with corn you have male at the top and female underneath, right? But it's also wind pollinated. Cross-pollination, right? So insect pollination, right? Like in squash, they have really big flowers. So bumblebees love squash. If you have a cucumber, it's going to have a much smaller flower, so you can have a different kind of insect that will pollinate that. Mouse melon, which I also have up here, is a cute little cucumber. It looks like a small watermelon, and it has little tiny flies that pollinate it. Pawpaw, which is an American plant that looks like a mango, and it's the only plant in that family that sort of, you could say, escaped from the tropics 35 million years ago. So it's pollinated by flies instead of bees or wasps. And then, then you have self-fertile plants, and that is where you have the male and the female in the same flower, right? And they're called selfing. And the nice thing about them is that they're very easy to save seeds from. You don't need to have a big population of plants. So if you're going to start saving seeds, selfing plants is a really nice place to start because it's easy. Beans and tomatoes and aubergine, for instance. And then there's self-pollinating, which is like beans and sunflowers. Peas and sunflowers are self-pollinating, but tomatoes aren't, right? So tomatoes, you shake the tree a little bit to pollinate it, or you let bees do it, right? Or both. And then you have, in fruit trees, for instance, it's important to know this, that some fruit trees need other fruit trees of the same species nearby to be pollinated. Otherwise, you can go years with a tree and think, oh, when is it going to give me fruit? And it will never give you fruit if it doesn't have another tree nearby, right? So for instance, one of the ones, the trees that I grow, it's a vine actually, it's called hardy kiwi, and it makes little kiwis that are the size of grapes, and you need to have a male. Otherwise, so I have one male and 12 females. And then you have the trees that are self-fertile. Inbreeders and outbreeders. That's a category that's kind of like a spectrum, right? You have very much inbreeding plants, and then you have very much outbreeding plants. And the reason why it's important to know is that if you're going to grow an outbreeding plant, like I'm very much just interested in everything from the brassica family, which is cabbage, and you need to have at least 2 plants for you to be able to get anywhere at all. But actually, you need to really have no less than 20 plants if you don't want to get genetic depression, right? And that's a really important factor when you're saving seeds, that you know how many individuals you need to be able to avoid genetic depression. And that's the same with humans, right? Or with wolves, for that matter, right? If there are less than 300 wolves in one pool, then they'll get genetic depression, right? So there's no point in keeping wolves in a population if there's less than 300. They're just going to become depressed. And the same thing goes with plants. So you can make, there are exceptions. You can, for instance, if you're desperate, you could have like 7 or 8 cabbage plants in one area and save seeds from them. In the seed savers, what we do is if we have several people who are doing that, then we just pool all the seeds together at the end of the year, and then we get the genetic diversity up again. Yeah, in breeding depression, that's what I was just talking about. So basically what ends up happening is you just get weaker and weaker plants every generation because there's less and less genes, genetic diversity in there. And what usually you would do then to fix that is you would, if you have a variety that's extremely valuable for some reason, and it's the last one, then you'll find a variety that's somewhat similar, and you'll breed it with that variety, and then you'll start the selection process again to sort of try and get back to the original trait. But you're never then going to be actually back where you started, right? You'll have a new variety that's somewhat similar looking in traits, right? So always know the minimum number of plants if you're going to save seeds, and keep that in mind. Self-incompatibility is interesting. So a lot of plants enable to avoid inbreeding. They have strategies to avoid that. One of them, for instance, is on squash plants, they'll have, the male will flower first. So if you see on the left here, those are all males. You can see because they have a finger sticking out in the middle. And this on the right is a female. Right? You can see the difference between these two flowers. Now, what will happen is if you have several plants that in nature that came up at different times, then the males from one, since they flowered at a different time than the female from another plant, they'll cross with the other individual instead of crossing with females from their own plant. So it's totally possible to take all these males and pollinate the female by hand on the same plant. But you're basically just cloning the plant then, right? So that's kind of point, then the whole sexual point is gone. So nature will do that automatically to try and ensure that that doesn't happen, or that to decrease the chance of that happening, right? There are many different techniques for that. And this is one of the ones that you'll picture that you'll get quite often. So what we'll do, if you have many different varieties of the same kind of plant, what you can do is you can put, in this case, a little rubber band around. So squash plants, they flower in the morning. And the evening before they flower, you can see that they're going to flower the next day. You can just, after a while, you'll notice it, which ones are going to flower. And then you just put a little rubber band around the males and the female that you want to pollinate. And what that does is that keeps the bee, you see the bumblebee there, it keeps the bumblebee from getting any of the pollen from the male and putting it on the female. So then you wake up the next morning and you cut off the male flowers, you take off all the petals, and you just have, and you pollinate, hand pollinate the female. You open the petals from the female. Hand pollinate, preferably with at least 3 flowers and preferably from different plants, right? The more pollen, the better. And then you close the female up again and eat the males. And you close the female up again so that she doesn't get pollinated by anybody else. Then you know that fruit that will grow underneath, you can see the females, they have a little fruit underneath on all the cucumbers. That's how you can tell also. Those are watermelons, by the way. Then you know, then you move the rubber band. When it falls off, you move the rubber band off the petal and onto the stem. And then you know you're saving seeds from that one and you know that it's true to kind, right? So that's one technique for saving seeds, a really easy one, fun to start with, big huge flowers, squash plants. Really fun to start with. Anything in cucumbers are just really fun. All right, so the difference between hybrids and seed varieties. And here we get a little bit back to seed banks again, and the whole reason why we're in the situation we're in now. So going back again 100 years, when machines started coming into agriculture, The machines came in and they had requirements. They needed to be a certain size. You had to be able to do everything really quickly. And so seed breeders started realizing that if you cross two different varieties of heirlooms, you would get what's called hybrid vigor. And what happens is that two different varieties, you get a much stronger plant out of two different varieties because there's a lot more genetic vigor, right? But that's only in what's called F1, which is the first generation hybrids. So if you look on a pack of seeds, often they'll say F1 on the pack of seeds. Then you're buying a hybrid. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, you get a beautiful plant, but if you try and save seeds from that plant, it's no longer open pollinated. It's no longer true to kind. Because F2, that is the children of the first hybrid. So what happens is, when you hybridize, you first get uniformity, right? So all the offspring are more or less the same. But then when you save seeds from that generation and you reproduce again, then you get huge amount of it. All the genetic diversity that's in that hybrid suddenly becomes expressed. And you can imagine two different lines of history merging and then suddenly, boom, right? So what you're seeing in F1 is in a way another bottleneck. It's a bottleneck of traits. And then out the other side of that bottleneck comes the full expression, the F2. And most people who try and grow F2 hybrids will not do it again because the diversity is so big that it's just depressing, like, where are you going to start? But plant breeders will look at that and go, that reminds me of something else I saw earlier in populations, right? Or in a land race where there's a whole lot of diversity. And they go, I could work with that. And then they'll start selecting. They'll select F2, F3, F4, F5. And then they'll try and stabilize the line again by selecting just the traits that they're looking for. So if you're going to play around with plants and you're going to try and create new varieties, this is how one of the techniques that's used for that. So there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't do that. In fact, it would be great if more people got to that level of playing around with nature, because that's actually how evolution happens, right? Or one of the ways in which evolution happens. So that's called dehybridization when you go through that process, right? And that's a lot of, you have to put selection pressure on that population consciously, depending on what criteria it is you're trying to breed. Before I continue, are there any questions? It's actually supposed to be interactive.
Yeah, I have a question. So hybrid is not the same as transgenic.
No.
Transgenic, you change the DNA, and hybrid, you bring two species together.
Right.
Two different species together.
Right. So, but from a historical perspective, there's a continuity, and let me just touch on that. So as seed companies began to realize that if we hybridize, whoever buys a seed from us, they're gonna come back and buy it again the next year. They realized that, in the 50s and 60s, or I don't exactly know when, but way back. And they said, okay, what we need to do then is we just need to be quiet about who the parents are. We're not going to tell anybody who the parents are. And that way they'll come back and buy seeds from us again next year. This is a good business plan. And so they did that. And then that kept happening over and over again, right? And so as long as the company knows and nobody else knows who the parents are, they can just keep doing that over and over again. And that's actually what you have. Most of agriculture today, that's why farmers, generally speaking, don't save their own seeds. It's because they're buying hybrids, and they don't know who the parents are, so they can't do the hybrid themselves. So that was the beginning of a lot of these multinational corporations. That was the beginning of their sort of, I would call it a stranglehold on reproduction, right? As long as you have, everybody knows who has the means of production. Everybody's heard about that for 150 years since Marx. But what about the means of reproduction? Nobody talks about that. But this is the means of reproduction, right? If you don't know how to reproduce, you can't. It's that simple, right? Yeah?
I just have a small question about the slideshow. Can you get a hold of it somehow?
Yeah. I'll add a link somewhere. I don't know.
So we want to make a documentation where we include it, because it's, your talk, and here's the slide, and we get like a neck, so we want to make a documentation for it.
Yeah, nice.
And enjoy.
Yeah, well, no worries. And then the segue was, then there's the whole American history of patenting, which I'm not going to get into. But in the beginning, they were patenting hybrids. They weren't patenting transgenic varieties. And then they moved over to patenting transgenetic varieties, as far as I recall. In any case, what we have now, regardless of whether you think genetic manipulation is a good thing or a bad thing, and I don't necessarily, personally, I think that doing research on genes is always a good thing. Research. But it's a whole other thing when you start introducing genes into populations, right? And it's a whole other thing when you start patenting genes, right? I think, personally, that ecology evolved, and I could do a whole presentation about how we think of ecology very much in production terms still, because that's the sort of driving ethos of our culture. But ecologies don't work like that. You know, there's a famous paper called What is Life by Erwin Schrödinger, who is a physicist, quantum physicist, right? He wrote this paper in 1944, and he basically looks at what life is, right? Not from the perspective of physics, but from the perspective of biology. And he says that life is two sets of processes. It's order from order and order from disorder, right? And so the order from disorder processes, that's like photosynthesis or metabolism, right? And that's the production part of life, right? We are producing energy from the sun and turning it into carbohydrates, which we eat, right? Everybody can understand that. But then what he says is that I can explain to you, it's just what he calls entropy offsetting, basically just dealing with entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. It's physics. But then you have the whole biological side of it, the genetic side of it, right? And he says that part we don't really understand. That's reproduction, that's order from order. It's a whole other set of processes. And when he said that in 1944, 10 years later, Watson and Crick discover the double helix, and they attribute, or in their Nobel Prize, they say, thank you, Schrödinger, for writing What is Life 10 years earlier, right? All this to say that we continue to look at life and ecosystems very much from a production focus, but it's two things. It's order from order and order from disorder. And if we ignore the order from order side, the reproduction side, and we only look at it from production all the time, we're missing something. And so the whole looking at it from a transgenic perspective is very much taking genes and turning them into production units and saying, we want to make these plants work for humans to do this. So it's anthropocentric, human-focused, and it's production-focused. Well, genes aren't production-focused. Genes are reproduction-focused. It's order from order process. You're treating it like order from disorder. It's the wrong category, right? So we're mixing these categories because most people don't have any concept of entropy. Nobody has thought about what is an ecosystem, how are stable ecosystems functioning, what is the role of humans in ecosystems, how do we interact? And therefore we think we can just divide everything up into genes, and we can move a gene from here to there and create a new plant and introduce that into an ecosystem because it's going to give us a bump in production. But as we saw earlier, bumps in production can lead to crashes in ecosystems. So, yeah. This is one technique, so I'm kind of moving over to techniques now. It's a little bit more banal maybe, but it's important to know. If you have two different varieties, let's say you have two different chilies, all right? Chilies, generally speaking, you don't have to worry about crossing, but if you're growing chilies that close, say this is a whole row of chilies that you planted, and you want to make sure that you keep these two different varieties separate, what you can do is you can make this net across the whole row, and then you can make a knot in between the two varieties, and then you can lift up the net on one variety for one day, or 2-3 days, and then all the flowers on that side will get pollinated by insects. And then you can close it and lift it up on the other side for a few days, and then all the flowers on that side will get pollinated by insects, and they won't cross, right? You guys understand the concept? So this is one technique that's used, and there's a really good documentary, or it's not really a documentary, it's a really good set, it's beautiful art, really well documented how to save seeds, all the different trees, all the important cultivars, and this is from that. So this is kind of a little bit of an advertisement. It's a French production, I think. This is my greenhouse in the spring. And those are heating cables, right? And this is a heating bench. So the whole greenhouse has 900 cubic meters, right? And the guy I bought it from, he would heat it with oil. Of course, since I'm anti-fossil fuels, I didn't buy the oil heater from him. And I had to figure out some other more environmentally friendly way. And one of my philosophies is opening bottlenecks, right? So we have to be opening bottlenecks, the right bottlenecks. And so one of them is definitely going to be heat. So what I've done here is I've created a microclimate inside of a microclimate. So we have the greenhouse, and then we've built a second greenhouse on top of it. There's insulation underneath, and it's all recycled material except for the plastic on the top. Insulation on the bottom, and then you can see there's a pulley. I can just pull the pulley, and that whole greenhouse goes up in the air. And then I can work on the bench. And then when it's cold at night, because in the springtime, in the daytime, as soon as the sun comes out, it's above zero in the greenhouse. It could be 20 outside, it'll be above zero in the greenhouse. As soon as nighttime comes, it's like switching a switch. It's minus again. But if you have a tiny greenhouse inside of the greenhouse with electric cables in the floor or in the table, then you're fine, right? Inside of that bench, there's 10 cubic meters. So that's 1% of the energy that I need compared to what the guy who was doing it before me is doing. My heating bill is 300 crowns a year. His heating bill is like 30,000, right? Now, in the springtime, plants are tiny. I can have 100 amaranth in this big of a pot. And you can imagine that means hundreds of thousands of amaranth plants I could have just in here. I've upgraded this now to where I can have 4 layers. So here you can see 2 layers of plants, right? So this is the 1.0, the next one is even better. And this is in May, right? And there are other pictures I have where the snow is all the way up to the line there, and inside it's full of plants, right? So this is in microclimates, right? These are techniques. We are in an extreme environment in Norway. There's a reason why culturally Norwegians have eaten fish and meat and not that many vegetables, you know. And the vegetables we did eat were like root vegetables, you know. It's because it's tough. But with climate change, one of the positive effects of climate change for us in Norway is that we already can grow a whole lot more than we could even 10, 15 years ago. And one of the things to think about when you're saving seeds is optimum, maximum, and minimum germination temperatures. Generally speaking, when you're growing plants, you want optimum germination if you're thinking from production. But if you're thinking from a perspective of reproduction, that may not be the case. If you're trying to adapt plants to harsher conditions and you keep giving them the best conditions, you're going to get some wimpy plants, right? Whereas if you're trying, like I'm trying to force my plants, right? I'm trying to put pressure on, selection pressure on plants that are already under pressure. Why? Global warming. We're all going to be extremely stressed. Trust me. We're all going to be extremely stressed moving forward. The quicker we get used to it, the quicker we learn how to adapt to it, the better. And one way is to start selecting out the wimps. That's just how it is, right? So what I do is, in this case, I sow plants. You can see there's still frost on the leaf there, right? I'll sow plants just on the surface. No protection. Harsh. 95% death. But the 5% that survive, winners. And I do that every year, right? After a few years, a plant that was adapted to Mexican conditions is more adapted to harsher climates. So you're doing what would have normally happened over thousands of years quickly, right? And that's what we need more of. And now this is just an idea that I had and I started doing it. There could be thousands of ideas like this. I mean, the human intellect, endless. You know, throw some art in there and then it'll get even more exciting. Selection. There's a lot you can say about selection. There are books written on selection, but my philosophy on selection is quite simple. Life is always selecting. Don't save everything. Don't save too little, otherwise you'll get depression. Selection pressure is high in Norway, so push plants even harder because of global warming. If you select too early, you might be selecting for slow germination, thicker seed coating, or seed dormancy mechanisms, right? So there are always trade-offs when you're selecting. And if you go down an alley and you find out that after 5 years, whatever you selected is crap, then you need to ask yourself why, and then start again. That's just how it works. Life is full of mistakes, endless amounts of mistakes. There's way more mistakes than there are successes. That's the whole point of having a lot, right? Which is what we do every time we boom. We have a lot, and then only a little bit makes it through. This is an example of selection for carrots, right? So the selection criteria for this carrot was, what is it? A certain kind of taste, a certain kind of form, a certain color. The core had to be a certain type of thickness. And then details like did it have a round or a shaped end, right? But those are all criteria that you would get that are industrial criteria. But just because you have, you start off with genetic material, germplasm, that has those criteria, doesn't mean you have to stick to it. We've created a lot of genetic bottlenecks with modern selection, right? I've been talking about that a lot. And that's largely because we've gone through a period of commodification of genes, anthropocentric commodification, right? And where uniformity is a good thing. Well, I disagree, right? We've had a long period of this, let's all be the same and follow the same pattern and do what everybody else is doing. Please, enough already. Your life is so much more interesting when you have diversity. I had a salad yesterday at Stephen Barstow's place. He's got 2,000 varieties of plants in his garden, and the salad had like 100 species in it. Ridiculous, right? Way more interesting, and you feel much better when you're connected to diversity than if you're just eating the same thing over and over again. So there's sort of more of a move towards populations and land races where you kind of let genetics play on its own, and you don't try to push it, dominate it too much. You let play enter into the picture. A little bit of randomness. If you're going to register a variety, if you ever get to that point, be aware that there are strict criteria, right? There's something called DUS, distinctiveness, uniformity, and stability, right? And that kind of is counter-natural. But you won't be able to patent a variety unless you are able to follow those standards. And it's thousands of euros to patent one variety, right? So what I feel anyway, there are many different trends within community seed banking. But my trend is definitely not towards uniformity, and my trend is more towards populations that are evolving dynamically in ecosystems. I'm much more interested in getting genetics from people who've been in tough areas where plants have survived than I am in some sort of uniform criteria that the EU has sort of defined. Populations of plants where genes move around is more natural, so we need to be widening bottlenecks. A little bit more about techniques. So you've grown your plant, it's all totally mature. At what point do you save the seeds for it? At what point are the seeds ripe? The general rule of thumb in Norway is wait until the very end. The plant can literally fall over from frost before you have to harvest it. And the longer you wait, the more likely it is you're going to have viable seeds. And then once you have ripe seeds, then there's the question of how do you process them. In this case, you can see not all seeds ripen at the same time. Right? This is Udo, Aurelia cortata, which is a Japanese sansai plant. In Japan, they have a long tradition, Japan, China, and Korea, of going up into the mountains and collecting wild plants. And this plant, Udo, is related to ginseng. So it has similar sort of adaptogenic properties. And it's hardy as can be. But you can see that the mature seeds here are not even. So in this case, I have to collect gradually in waves, only the mature ones, and then wait until the other ones mature. So to get good, clean, dry seeds, there's wet processing, which you do with tomatoes and aubergine and a number of other cucumbers also. And it's fairly simple. Around a tomato plant, or around a tomato seed, there's a kind of a gel. You know, when you eat the tomato seed, you can kind of feel that gel. And that gel kind of inhibits sprouting. So it keeps the seed from sprouting. And to save the seed, we have to dry it. And if we dry it with that gel on, it's more likely to get fungus and kind of nasty, especially if there's any kind of humidity. And you don't want that. So what you do is I just squeeze all the tomatoes, take off the skin by just squeezing them in water. This is why it's called wet processing. And then you take out all the skin, and then you just leave it for a day or two in a window. And what happens is the meat or that gelatin rots, and it floats to the top because seeds are heavy. They have all the energy stored in them. So the seeds sink to the bottom, and the junk floats to the top, and then you just pour it out, and you rinse it a couple times, and then you put it in your dryer. It's really simple. I'm always saving tomato seeds constantly. Every time I'm out there, if there's any tomatoes that have fallen down or tomatoes that are cracked, because if they're cracked, they may have got some kind of bacteria in, and if you eat them, you might get sick. But they're perfectly good for saving seeds. So those I just squeeze into jars and then leave them in the window, and then if you're constantly doing that over a season, you'll have a lot of seeds. Carrot, then there's dry seed processing, right? And that's like carrots, cabbage, peas, beans, amaranth, spinach. And there are many different methods. But if they're really small seeds like amaranth or spinach, then what you can do is just lay a tarp down and walk on them. And then you're separating the chaff and the stems from the seeds. And then you winnow, you get like a big surface in a day when it's a little bit windy, but not too windy. And then you just throw it up like this and it blows all the chaff away. Or you can get a little fan, which also works fine. But I would say if any of you end up getting a greenhouse, don't store seeds in a greenhouse. Firstly, it's usually more humid in a greenhouse, so they're more likely to sprout. Secondly, rodents love greenhouses, and they love seeds, as we mentioned in the beginning. So you're going to get those hoarding mice in there, trying to... In the beginning, you saw the bench that I used. I started using that for processing seeds in the beginning, until I realized that that's useless. So basically, you have to kind of bring it into a rodent-free zone, and you want to get them dry as soon as possible. That's the basic rule. So I highly advise to get one of these. I only have one, and I could have two, hypothetically, but one is plenty. And they're not too expensive. The thing that's good about this one is that it can go down to, it's a dehumidifier, which you can use for dehumidifying anything. Usually people use it for dehumidifying vegetables or berries or whatever. But the nice thing about this one is that it goes all the way down to below to like 20 degrees. And with seeds, if you dry seeds at a high temperature, you're going to lose some of the vitality of the seed, right? So the percentage that sprout, you want that to be as high as possible. Generally speaking, you want it to be above 80, and often it's like 95%. And the way you test that is you just sprout 10 seeds. How many of them sprout? 10? Okay, that's 100%. Hypothetically, you'd want to do, you could do 50, and then you'd be more precise. And of course, the seed company will do like 50 or 100 and see how many, and then they'll write 97%, right, sprouting. But if you dry seeds at over 40 degrees, you're going to lose a lot of the viability. So you want to dry them at room temperature, around 20 degrees, preferably. There are many different ways of doing that. I do a lot of drying of smaller seeds in windowsills. Works perfectly fine. Rice is another way. On paper, yeah. And then there's fermentation, which is where you let the plant rot before you save the seeds. The benefit of doing that is that you can think of a seed like an embryo, inside of a placenta. It's very much the same thing. You want to keep, the baby wants to stay inside the womb as long as possible, right? 9 months in the case of humans. And if you take it out early, it's not ripe. And it's the same thing here with some fruit. The fruit wants to, in cucumbers in general, you want the fruit to be completely almost rotten before you take it out. You can save seeds, like if you're eating a watermelon, if you save seeds from a watermelon that's ripe, probably it's going to be 80% sprouting, no problem. But you're going to get a little bit less vigor maybe than if you had one that was rotten first. So you're just giving the seed time to mature totally by letting it rot. So my general rule of thumb is if it's a cucumber, I let it rot, or at least mature very far. Like with the mandan squash, I just leave them in the window, and I slowly eat them, and then save seeds from them, right? And I try to eat them as late as possible because I eat everything that's fresh until the snow comes. And the nice thing about that mandan squash is it stays all the way till Christmas, no problem. And then there's storing. So the two cardinal rules for storing is dry and cool. Dry is more important than cool. If you cool down a seed when it's not dry, if you cool it down too much, it'll snap, and then it'll be dead, right? So if you freeze a wet seed, it'll die. Not always. Some seeds are able to stay dry inside. Like for instance, brassica seeds are able to survive winters outside on their own before they're totally dry. But as a general rule, you want to dry it. If you're going to freeze for long storage, like what they do in Svalbard they have to get the humidity levels down to 5% before they put them in the seed vault, right? And usually the seeds that you dry are around 18 to 20% room temperature. So you'd have to just push them to dry them even more if you're going to freeze them down. You want down to around 5% humidity before you put them in the freezer. Then there are all different kinds of ways of storing them, right? But basically, what I do is I store them. If there's plants that I'm going to sell or give away, then I just put them in paper bags like that, and they're out within a few months. If I'm going to store them for a year, I have a chest that I have in the kitchen where I store most of it. And if I'm going to store it over several years, like a year or two, then I put it in the fridge in an airtight container in zip bags. And if I'm going to store it for many years, then I dehumidify it, wrap it, suck all the air out of it, and put it in the freezer. So those are the basic rules. One trick that somebody taught me is that if you want to, the less air, the better. So if you have a jar with bean seeds, let's say, and there's a little bit of air at the top, you can just take a little piece of paper, light it, put it in the jar, and close the jar. And all the oxygen will be burnt out, and it'll create a vacuum, and then that little bit of air won't matter. So that's one trick for getting all the air out of the jar before you store it. Now there's something called a hammer test for testing how dry a seed is if you're not sure. First, if it's a big seed, you try and snap it. If it doesn't snap, it's not dry enough, right? And then there's the hammer. If you knock it, put it on the ground and smash it, if it doesn't shatter, it's not dry enough. That's like for a long-term storage. And it is a good idea to have an overview of your seeds. I have an Excel list of all the seeds that I have, when they were saved, and all the important information. This is my son Dean, and this is what we do in the wintertime. He gets 1 crown for every bag of seeds. So that's a nice activity to do. You can see the Christmas curtains are up there in the back. This is what it looks like on my farm in the wintertime. Not much going on. The greenhouse is sleeping, but you can still work with seeds. And that's when you make plans for the next year. That's when you're looking in catalogs, trying to find new plants, right? New varieties that you're going to try for the next year. So it never ends. Clones. I was talking a little bit with somebody here earlier about garlic. I was mentioning that they're all clones, right? So there's no sexual reproduction. It's really important, I can't stress this enough, that in any clone, you must save the healthy clones only and eat the non-healthy ones. Because the seed process enables a lot of viruses and sicknesses to be excluded between the parent and the offspring. But clones don't have that ability because they're actually a part of the plant, right? So in the case of if you're saving a garlic, right, it's been with all the other cloves the whole time, and then you're breaking it off. So it'll have all the viruses and all the fungus and everything will be on that clone. So it's really important to think about health. And it's really important that if you import any clones to your farm, that you make sure you get it from somebody who knows what they're doing, and you make sure that they don't bring you some sort of virus. It's not actually legal to import clones to Norway without a health certificate. So be aware. It's also not legal to plant potatoes that you bought in the store. You have to buy potatoes from somebody who has virus-free potatoes. And the Norwegian Seed Savers, we are the arm of virus-free potatoes to the general public in Norway from the Gene Resource Center. So if you want varieties of potatoes that you can grow yourself, then join the Norwegian Seed Savers Potato Guild. Here you see another example. This is a leek, right, that just started sprouting vegetatively. So I just cut that head off and stuck it in the ground. And then next year I'm going to have 100 baby plants. So that's another way. Here are 4 different kinds of garlic. The biggest one is called elephant garlic, which isn't even a garlic. It's actually a kind of a leek. Just to show you that there's lots of variety. Finding germplasm, so sourcing seed. It's really important if you're going to be growing, that you know where you get your seeds from. Firstly, is it organic? Secondly, is it open source? Right? You don't want seeds that aren't open source unless you really know what you're doing. Right? If you're a geneticist or if you're going to actually breed new varieties, fine. But generally speaking, you want to start off with healthy plants that have been grown organically and where they're true to kind. Some places that I source seeds from are the Experimental Farm Network, which is an American plant breeding outfit that try all kinds of different plants. Then there's something called the Open Source Seed Initiative, which is quite interesting. Another whole group of farmers. And it's sort of like open source software, right? Same sort of philosophy, but with seeds. And then there's the US National Germplasm System, or also called GRIND, which I trial a whole bunch of amaranth, and from all over the world, and you can just order endless amounts of them. And then there's something called Plants for a Future, which is really good to know. You can go in there and they have thousands of plants and they give you all the information on the plant, right? So for instance, here I just typed in Udo and it tells you all the information, how edible it is, where it's from, habitat, cultivation details, everything. Really useful resource for finding interesting plants. Then there are key people, key keystones all around the world who've been doing this thing for a while. This guy, Dr. Alan Kappeler, the orange centerfold tomatoes that I have here are from him, the best tomatoes in the world. At least best the ones I've ever tasted. Little orange tomatoes that he selected, he crossed with some Bolivian, like crypto or original tomatoes, right, to bring in some genetic vigor. And then he did the dehybridization over many generations and he got this new line of tomatoes that are like ridiculous, extremely good tasting and vigorous. And he grows in Oregon, so always try and pick from people who've been doing work in similar types of climates. I tried stuff from like New Mexico and stuff, useless. You can't grow those plants up here. You can try, but it's not, you might be lucky, but generally speaking, you want to find people who've already been doing work on it. Records, I'm not going to go into all of this, but these are my records, right? So Excel is the backbone of keeping track of everything. How many, when, if there's any issues, what's the source, all that kind of stuff. Put it all into records. And if you're going to do trialing, that's like if you're going to try out. In the beginning, it's really fun to try, right? So I tried like 50 different kinds of squash before I narrowed it down, right? Do that, but take records from the beginning so that you know, because there's no way you'll be able to remember. And it's loads of fun in the beginning to trial this stuff, right? So keep records, dates, sources, varieties, everything, the weather. The more information you're able to save that's relevant, the better for you. Of course, it takes time, so it's a trade-off. You have to ask before you start. You can't just randomly try stuff, but if you ask yourself, what are you looking for to begin with, then you're going to have a better time finding the right kind of germplasm. What kind of diseases? Think about that when you start off. What might you come up against? What kind of problems? And how big of a population you need, be realistic about that. Controls. So whenever I come across a question, I ask Stephen, what should I do? Should I do this or should I do that? He always said, do both. So you just split whatever you have in half, and you do both. And maybe you will get half as much out of it, but you'll get more knowledge. You'll know. You'll have done both, right? So there's, try all kinds of different stuff, especially in the beginning, until you figure out, should you use drip irrigation or should you use sprinkle irrigation? All these things. How much mulch? This much mulch? This much mulch? All kinds of questions that will come up in the beginning. Keep trying and keep records of what you've done, and then build on your successes. How much will you eat is an important question. I've learned from experience that growing too much of stuff that you're not going to eat is kind of irritating, because what are you going to do with all this food? You have all this food and you're giving it away to your neighbors and stuff, and after a while you're just like, it's too much. So then the next year you do half as much, and that gives you the ability to do more of something else, right? So learning how much do you need to keep things stable, but then not so much that it gives you extra work. And then of course evaluate afterwards, right? A lot of stuff that you don't think about in the beginning that you have to think about is where you're growing stuff. Where do seeds reproduce well? On the edge of the property or in the center of the property. Sometimes it's the opposite of what you think. But paying attention to those little differences in microclimates, that's really, in Norway, it's more, microclimates are the key word in Norway. Norway is a land of microclimates. Wherever there are people, it's where they found microclimates. There are no people on Hardangervidda, there are very few. Taste, obviously, look, connection. So for me, the most important thing in growing anything is, have I built a good connection with it? And by connection, I don't just mean I like the plant, it looks good, but has it become a part of me, right? And for a plant to become a part of me, I have to eat it and enjoy eating it a lot, to the point where I want to reproduce it. And then I'm connecting with its reproductive cycle. So you're going to connect first to the plant as individual, then you're going to connect to its nutrient cycles, then you're going to connect to its reproductive cycles. When you're doing all of that, then it's a part of your clan. Then it's a part of who you are. You eat it, right? And it relies on you for its reproduction. It's a symbiotic relationship. It's not just something you go and buy in the store, right? You're evolving with it. It's evolving with you. You're creating a tradition. You're going to pass that heritage on to the next generation. That's the web of life. That's taking part in your ecology, maintaining sound ecosystems, right? What went wrong? That's important. You'll make a lot of mistakes in the beginning, and it's really depressing sometimes. God damn this shit, I'm never doing it again. And then you wait a year and you realize you made that mistake and that mistake. All right, fine, I'll try it again. But after sometimes you'll do stuff like, I've been growing a certain plant, I'm not going to mention names because I like it, but I don't want to grow it again. And finally it's out after 5 years. So, and yeah. Unexpected findings are really, really important. Suddenly, somebody sent me a picture the other day on Facebook of a red garlic. Nobody's ever seen that happen before. Why did that happen? We don't know. But now there's a red garlic. Amazing, right? Now, if he was an idiot and he thought, oh, it's probably because of the beet juice I poured on it, we wouldn't have red garlics. And that's how almost all the diversity that we have has happened. Somebody was paying attention to their ecology, noticed a hybrid, noticed gene manipulation, and said, that's cool, right? Right, and then a little bit of propaganda about the Norwegian seed savers here towards the end. The Norwegian seed savers have 500 members. We have, of those 500 members, about 50 are active in saving seeds. And this is quite normal for almost all community seed banks around the world, that only 10% of the members actually take care of seeds. I shouldn't say that. More than 10% take care, but only 10% feel confident enough about their knowledge and what they've reproduced to share it. So one of our ambitions is to increase that percentage. If we can get, 15% of our members to not only save seeds but to share seeds, then we've done a good job. And so therefore we divided our organization up into guilds. And guilds are basically just connected to families of plants, right? So for instance, we have the allium guilds. Anybody who's interested in anything that has to do with onions, go there, and you'll learn everything you need to know from Stephen Barstow, who's the guru, right? Then we have all the nut and tree fruit guild. If you're interested in trees, go there. Brassica, that's me, all the cabbage stuff. Amaranth, anything that has to do with spinach or any of that, that's me as well. And you start off with one guild, and then you pick one variety that you are in charge, that you're responsible for, right? You learn how to manage that one. Once you've gone that one under, or you can do more than one if you have capacity, but start with one, an easy one. And then, once you're able to share that, then do another one, right? Because it is about, we have to not just be consumers. We have to be producers, all of us. We have to not think, we have to get out of the production mode and into the reproduction mode, right? And that's a shift that takes time, right? But if you make that mental shift that that's what you should be doing, that there's joy in reproducing, way more joy in reproducing than in producing, right? Something lasting, something that's going to be past you, right? Something that gives you a little bit of pride, that you've actually achieved something, not just consumed, right? So that's what we want to get more people involved in. We're trying to work on databases in all of the community seed banks around Europe, trying to figure out how are we going to do this in a system that's good for ecology, that builds diversity. And that's something that we're working on. I won't talk too much about that. We just now started a Nordic cooperation called Nienwood Discomant, where we got funding to introduce rare varieties of plants that are part of the cultural heritage of the Nordic region. And that's something we're going to be doing for the next couple of years. So there's a lot going on, and we're sort of tying the bonds to other cultures, other organizations in the neighboring countries. And here's like the list of all the different guilds that we have. And you can see there's still some empty spots for some of the areas where we don't have managers yet. And the same is the case for Sweden and Denmark. They also have guilds. So we're basically copying the systems in the other countries. This is the Amaranth Guild, which is my favorite guild, personally, because there's so much good eating there. And it's so easy to save seeds from anything in the amaranth family. So if you look up there, like half the stuff up there is in the amaranth family. Like spinach, super easy. Really important to know when to sow spinach. If you sow it in the spring, like everybody thinks you should, it's just going to go straight to seed, because it bolts when there's more than 12 hours of light. So I'm sowing spinach now. As I rip out cucumbers, I sow spinach. And I eat spinach all the way until Christmas. And then it dies back, and then it comes back again in the spring. So it's the last thing I eat, and it's the first thing I eat. There's only 3 months out of the year where I don't eat greens and breads is what I call it, right? There's a lot in the amaranth. There's a lot of bread as well. Humans, like I was saying, we instinctively, it's not just seeds, but it's plants that we instinctively want to eat, right? But we sort of focus so much on eating seeds. Like most of what we eat, it's either animals or it's seeds, right? Bread and butter and milk. But it's the plants that we should be eating, So like you should be eating, I eat that much greens every day. Huge bowl, right? Fry it down, make it into salad or whatever. And when you're doing that, you're eating your own stuff every day. And then you're eating what you're connected to instead of going to the store and buying something, right? And then you're eating healthy, local. So yeah, that's one of the reasons why I think amaranth is great, because there's so much. And as soon as one wave is done, the next wave starts, right? So amaranth is in season now, because it's a Mexican plant, right? Gorgeous, gorgeous plant. This is a different kind of amaranth. This is strawberry spinach, which is also an amaranth family, right? And it looks like spinach, but it also makes these gorgeous little berries, which is super easy to save seeds from. When you wash them, little black seeds fall out, and you just put them in the window. Bingo, you got seeds for next year. Who doesn't want a spinach plant that gives you strawberries, that doesn't need sprays, and that you can sow and save seeds from easily? It's ridiculous. So easy. Red Atriplex hortensis. Probably my favorite plant. It's a weed. Meldestock. It's the farmers go and spray to hell every year. This is the cousin of the meldestock. It's also in the same family as beet. So you can see the beta carotene in it. When you wash it, it comes off a little bit of red, just like with the beets, right? Super healthy. Amazing plant. And like I showed earlier, you can sow it before the frost is done. What's not to like? Super easy to save seeds from.
Is that one molla?
Huh?
Molla?
No. Meldestock. It's in the same family as meldestock.
Okay.
Yeah. I already talked about. Here's another a method that I didn't mention, but you see here, this is called a crab. And in Shetland, they would build these 1.5 meter high walls, and they would, you see that picture, he's called spitting the crab in Scottish, where you put the seeds in your mouth and you spit them out. So that was a technique. And this was a microculture. They didn't have greenhouses. So this is what they did. And you can see they built it at the cliff edge. So the wind blows like crazy. Same in the West Coast. They grow really well on the West Coast. The wind would come up to the side and would just blow up like this, and would create a little microclimate right there, and that's where they built another microclimate in that microclimate, right? So 2 microclimates, and then they would spit the crop in the fall or late summer, so that the plants would be like teenage size, and they would do the hardy. They wouldn't give them good soil. They'd give them rough, tough soil, just enough, make them hardy, teenagers, and then they'd force them through the winter, like that, and that was the stock for the next year. Right? So this is our old culture that nobody remembers anymore. That's it.